The Russian Sleep Experiment, new version. In 1945, deep within the heart of the Soviet Union, a covert project known only as the Sleep Trial was initiated under the strict supervision of the KGB. The Soviet government, constantly searching for ways to outmaneuver their enemies, focused on human endurance in extreme conditions. The experiment, originally conceived as a form of enhanced interrogation, was aimed at determining how long a human could survive without sleep, and whether total sleep deprivation could produce a state of enhanced mental clarity or even superhuman strength. 5 test subjects were chosen for the experiment, prisoners of war, all deemed expendable in the eyes of the regime. They were young men in their early 20s, their bodies hardened by years of military training and imprisonment. They were housed in a small, isolated underground facility, equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment and a sterile, clinical environment. For the purposes of the study, the subjects were told that they would only be deprived of sleep for a month, after which they would be allowed to rest and recover. The subjects were placed in individual rooms, each containing only a cot, a microphone, and a camera. They were administered small doses of a stimulant drug to keep them awake, and their every movement was monitored. They were told that their task was simple: remain awake for as long as possible and follow orders. The experiment was meant to test their willpower, but what the scientists didn't expect was the otherworldly toll it would take on the minds of the subjects. On the first few days, everything seemed normal. The men appeared tired, irritable, and unfocused. Their eyes grew heavy, but they persevered, staring blankly at the walls. They were told not to speak unless spoken to, and food was delivered through small hatches in their rooms. The experiment's leaders watched from their observation room, making notes and discussing the progress of the trial. But even they could not have predicted the horrors that awaited. On day 5, the first of the subjects, Ivan, began to behave strangely. His once stoic demeanor became erratic, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He began whispering to himself, speaking in jumbled sentences that made no sense. At night, the guards heard him muttering about shadows moving and eyes in the dark. By day 7, Ivan had stopped responding to the scientists' calls for data. When they checked his room, they found him sitting motionless in the corner, staring at the wall. His eyes were wide open and glazed, his body stiff, as if frozen in a trance. By day 10, the other subjects began to show similar signs of deterioration. They became irritable, agitated, and their speech grew incoherent. They started to experience vivid hallucinations. The once confined, isolated rooms no longer felt safe. A sense of claustrophobia set in as each man struggled to fight against the invisible forces of exhaustion, knowing that sleep was no longer an option. On day 13, things took a dark turn. One of the subjects, Alexei, began to scream. He was convulsing in his cot, violently shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The doctors rushed to his room, but when they opened the door, they were met with an impossible sight. Alexei was crouched in the center of his room, his hands clutching at his head, his mouth wide open in a silent scream. His body had withered, as if aging rapidly before their eyes. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his veins bulged as though they were about to burst. His eyes were hollow, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that seemed unnatural, twisted into something unrecognizable. When the doctors tried to move him, Alexei lashed out with terrifying strength, his movements jerky and unnatural. His scream echoed in their ears, and the doctors recoiled, unable to approach without fear of being attacked. In an instant, Alexei collapsed onto the ground, his body stiffening into a contorted shape. He was dead. But what shocked the doctors more was the blood, soaked into the floor beneath him. Yet curiously, it seemed like it had been drained from his body, as if he had been consumed from the inside out. The experiment continued. By day 16, the remaining 4 subjects were no longer recognizable as human. Their bodies were gaunt, their faces gaunt and hollow. They no longer communicated with the researchers, speaking only in whispers to each other. But those whispers carried a strange, malevolent tone. They had stopped acknowledging the presence of the scientists entirely, and their bodies became more and more erratic. On day 20, the last surviving subject, Mikhail, tore at the walls of his cell. His fingernails were broken, his body raw and bruised, but he had an unholy intensity in his eyes. When the guards attempted to intervene, Mikhail turned to them with a feral growl, his face now twisted in the same unnerving grin that Alexei had worn. The guards recoiled, but Mikhail did not attack. They only saw his eyes. Those hollow, lifeless eyes that seemed to look through them, as though they could see their deepest fears. And then, suddenly, he fell silent, his mouth curling upward in a final, grotesque smile. The remaining scientists abandoned the project, realizing that it had gone far beyond the realm of their understanding. The facility was shut down, and all records were destroyed. The surviving guards, too, were transferred or erased from existence, as if the government wanted to wipe clean the dark, twisted reality of what had occurred in those underground chambers. Years later, rumors began to spread among those who had been involved in the project. Whispers of what had truly happened in that underground facility became legends. Some claimed that the subjects had gained access to something beyond the physical realm, a gateway to an alternate dimension where time and sleep no longer held meaning. Others said that the men had become something else entirely, something more than human, but far less than mortal. That they were still out there, waiting in the shadows, driven mad by the horrors they had uncovered. In the end, the Russian sleep experiment became just another forgotten secret of the Soviet Union, an experiment that went too far. But it left behind something that no one could quite explain, a nightmare that never ended. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when you're struggling to keep your eyes open, you might feel it, something just behind you, something waiting in the dark.